Hello, everyone, and welcome to weeks 5 and 6 of our church history survey from the time of Christ to the time of the Reformation. I say weeks 5 and 6 because once again this week, the end of week 5 and the beginning of week 6, I will be out of town and not quite as able to be regularly online or be at a trustworthy Wi-Fi location where I know that I'll be able to record a video specifically for week 6. So I'm going to go ahead and try to just cover the lecture material for both weeks 5 and 6 in a three-part video introduction here to week 5. So I'll post this three-part video introduction under the module for week 5. And it'll be three parts because, of course, we have a fair bit to cover here, not just over 2 weeks, but certainly as we are now moving into the 3rd and 4th century, as well as really the first half of the 5th century, from the 200s to the time of Chalcedon, what is widely considered the 4th Ecumenical Council, the Council of Chalcedon in 451. As I've indicated previously, as you've no doubt discovered in looking at the McCulloch text, that council really brings to conclusion the first major subsection of his text, and it sort of brings to culmination many of the things that we've been discussing, the developments of doctrine, events in the life of the church as it developed from the time of Christ up until the mid-5th century. What we'll see is that by 451, certainly the church has reached a centralized kind of authority, which, for instance, your reading for week 6 by Virginia Burris and Rebecca Lyman out of the Jan's text, that reading will indicate that such a centralized authority was, of course, not really there for the first couple of centuries of Christian faith, which is to be expected, of course, giving, at least in a broad sense, given the relative newness of this faith tradition. But nevertheless, by 451, certainly after the time of Constantine, as we're going to discuss, and your readings will make clear, as the church enters into a much more cordial relationship, if you like, with the Roman Empire, and then the centralization of its authority accelerates to a point where by 451, it is able to do what it really would never be able to do in the early centuries when the church was really mostly just a collection of local communities. Now it can sort of decree, if you like, certain doctrinal distinctives that identify the majority church, or what history will record as the small O Orthodox Church, not capital O Orthodoxy as in Eastern Orthodoxy, but small O Orthodoxy, over against heterodoxy or heresy. This sort of naming or, again, labeling of viewpoints which are not taken to be accurately reflective of Jesus' life and ministry, his teaching, the apostolic deposit of faith that is passed along. These will be progressively excluded from the church. And so after 451, we will really have the first sort of enduring divisions between a majority church, the Church of Chalcedon, and other movements, Christian movements outside of that, especially the Syriac Church, the Coptic Church in Egypt. So that's the direction that we're moving, and there's a tremendous amount to cover, certainly before we get there through the 200s, the 300s, and the first part of the 400s. So let's dive right in and begin by talking about a thread, or picking up a thread, I should say, that we started to talk about more in earnest last week, and that is periodic persecution in the church. I mentioned in last week's video introduction the persecution under Emperor Domitian. And here I'll give you just a handy way. Maybe this will serve as a handy memory aid for some of you. I don't mean to be trite in saying this or sharing this, but it can be a way of helping the memory. 3 Ds, 3 emperors whose names started with the letter D: Domitian, Decius, and Diocletian. As we move from Domitian, which again is the traditional dating of the book of his reign provides the traditional dating for the book of Revelation in the mid-90s, to Decius, mid-200s, the Decian persecution we'll talk a little bit more about here in just a moment. into then the Diocletian persecution, which is considered the Great Persecution, beginning with an edict in 303 and then concluding with the Edict of Milan issued by Constantine in 313. So again, Domitian, Decius, and Diocletian. I mention, as we're getting now into the 200s, I mention the Decian persecution in part because from the Decian persecution, there are a couple significant developments that come in terms of the life of the church, and even including historical artifacts. We have out of the Decian persecution a collection of libelli, which again, these are textual artifacts, and they are really what they are, signed statements of sacrifice. Let me read to you very briefly a English translation of one of these documents following or resulting, I should say, from the persecution of Decius in the year 250. Firsthand, to the commission chosen to superintend the sacrifices at the village of Alexander's Isle, from Aurelius Diogenes, son of Satabaus, of the village of Alexander's Isle, aged 72 years, with a scar on the right eyebrow. I have always sacrificed to the gods, and now in your presence, in accordance with the edict, I have made sacrifice and poured a libation, and partaken of the sacred victims. I request you to certify this below. Farewell. I, Aurelius Diogenes, have presented this petition. Secondhand, I, Aurelius Cyrus, saw you and your son sacrificing. Third hand, and so on. So the idea here is that we have a document, a signed document indicating someone who has complied with the edict issued by Emperor Decius in 250 that all citizens of the Roman Empire must sacrifice to the gods. And McCulloch does a great job of explaining why Decius would issue such an edict and what the effect of this would be on the growing, spreading Christian church in the middle of the 200s. Very briefly, this is roughly the anniversary of the Roman identity, the 1000th, anniversary of Roman identity. There's a cultural sense, in other words, of what it means to be a Roman. There is an empire-wide crisis after the death of Trajan, which goes back a century before this. You've read a correspondence from Trajan, so you know that there we're talking about the early 100s. So for about a century, there has been, after Trajan's death, there's been something of an empire-wide crisis where it has had an increasingly difficult time maintaining its borders. At the outer edges, peoples are pushing back, and so you have a kind of a sense of being Roman and what it means to be Roman, the religious history of Rome, and a kind of assertion of the need to hold on to that religious history, connected with a sense that maybe the reason that Rome is suffering at this point is that it is losing touch with its gods, its religious heritage, and there's some disfavor, divine disfavor, that is being shown to it, and the Christians then would certainly make for a target in such an environment as that. So that's one thing to focus on this week in your readings: this continued persecution through the mid-200s. Coming out of that, it's not just the libelli, as I mentioned. We also have an important development with regards to Christian teaching, and especially, more exactly, the nature of ecclesial authority. So two individuals in particular are very important. Cyprian of Carthage, who was bishop from 249 to 258. He was martyred himself in 258. And a priest of Phrygia named Novatian, who lived from 202 and who also died himself in 258. Coming out of the Decian persecution, the church kind of divides, I shouldn't say that. That's a little bit too broad. There are categories now with which to identify, or by which to identify folks who have come out of this time of persecution. There are those who held on strongly to their faith, even under threat of death, and perhaps survived, but did so only at the great loss of property. We know certainly that property was taken away from Christians, possibly some other form of physical suffering. These are called confessors. Over and against them are the lapsed, those who, in the face of persecution, perhaps as we read from the libelli, they made sacrifices to the gods, poured out a libation to the gods, even ate the ritual food sacrificed to the gods, and in some way rejected or expressed a rejection of their Christian faith. And so now, as the church has come through this time of persecution, there is a question about how to treat the lapsed. Should they just simply be brought back into fellowship with other Christians? More narrowly, with regards to Cyprian, again, of Carthage and Novatian, the question that arises is what to do specifically with those church leaders, especially bishops, who perhaps have lapsed or who fled rather than endured persecution, who are not necessarily confessors, but who fled persecution. And so Novatian presents a position that is often called by historians a rigorist position. He's a rigorist, and he resists simple admission or readmission of the lapsed into community, but more narrowly, he questions the legitimacy of bishops who carry out their office of forgiving sins. How can someone who has sinned, in his imagination, how can someone who has sinned so grievously now pronounce the forgiveness of sins to someone else? Cyprian takes a more measured approach. Cyprian argues, and this will become very significant, as you can imagine, again, for the development of church teaching and church authority. Cyprian argues that the forgiveness of sins is not contingent upon the purity of the one doing the forgiving, the bishop. It is the office itself, the ordained office of bishop itself, which confers the authority to forgive sins. Now, again, as the church is going to develop, this is before the time where a recognized singular bishop in Rome is identified by a worldwide church to be the vicar of Christ on behalf of the whole worldwide church and dispensing forgiveness of sins. So for Cyprian to start to write that it is this office unto itself, that where the forgiveness of sins that was brought into the world by Christ is now to be mediated. It is in the office of the bishop. This will be very significant, of course, for the development of ecclesial structure and, again, ecclesial authority. Subsequently, bishops will certainly appeal to Cyprian and to Cyprian's writings in this coming out of this time of Decian persecution to substantiate their claims to authority. Again, based in simply holding the office of bishop. There is finally two sort of additional doctrinal issues to identify here for this first part of our three-part video introduction to weeks 5 and 6. Neoplatonism and Manichaeism. Now, as McCulloch makes clear, Mani, who was a self-styled prophet, if you like, who died around the year 276 from the Parthian Empire to the east of Rome, of the Roman Empire. Mani was not a Neoplatonist, again, because he's a Parthian, but nevertheless, and Neoplatonism, the extent to which it's extended over there, this is beyond the scope of our class to get into the philosophical spread of Neoplatonism. But nevertheless, the idea is that Neoplatonism, of course, is most definitely a Greek philosophical tradition, which, as you have read and are probably aware, has a very low view of the material world. It identifies a kind of break between immaterial and material existence. It inherits this way of thinking from Plato himself. And it identifies higher order existence the farther up the ladder, if you like, of immateriality that you go. The lower down you come into the material world, the farther away you are from the source of being, i.e. God. Mani has, although again not coming out of that tradition per se, Mani has a similar way of thinking about reality, and he suggests that, again, this world, the material world that we live in, was created not by the good God, if you like, but kind of an evil alternative to God, a God that is trying to trap the light, this immaterial, pure existence of light in material beings, and so creates the world for that purpose. Now, I won't go into the full details of Manichaean teaching, but we see certainly through the 200s church leaders dialoguing and writing with and against Manichaeism. And I want to make you aware of that. Certainly, as we come to about a century and a half later, again into the early 400s, probably the most significant writer who wrote against Manichaeism is Augustine of Hippo, and he did so as one time himself a Manichae. So I'm simply raising this up for you to read about, think about a little bit more as an alternative to the Christian faith. Manichaeism sees Jesus as a Neoplatonist would, but again from a different background, sees Jesus as a teacher who is trying to instruct his disciples in a body of information and a way of existing, more importantly, a sort of ascetic self-denial that enables them to transcend the materiality of their existence and reach into a higher order spiritual, or a better way of putting it would be immaterial realm. And so the Christian church, one more time, has to decide whether or not that is an accurate reflection of the deposit of faith passed along by the apostles. In addition to that Christological issue, who is Jesus? Was he truly a material being like the rest of us, or was he some sort of special kind of existence enabling us to find a way to transcend our own materiality? There's another kind of Christological issue that develops, and that is adoptionism, as it will later become called. And here the figure to lift up from the 200s is Paul of Samosata, bishop from 260 to 268. Paul's teaching is difficult to articulate in any kind of detail. It's pretty dense, the writings that we do have, but nevertheless, most have found Paul to teach that, I should say, that there is one essence in God, and that this essence, like if you like copper, is like copper, and all pennies that might come from this essence are of the same essence, but they're not, of course, if you like, the same substantial existence or something like that as this one essence. And so the idea is that Christ, the Logos, the Word of God, derives from the essence of God, but is not, if you will, one with the essence of God in any co-eternal, we might say, sense. That's one form of adoptionism. Another form of adoptionism, and you've already encountered this in our reading from Hermas last week, would be the idea that Jesus of Nazareth, the human being Jesus, is, if you like, adopted into the Godhead by the action of the Holy Spirit. I mentioned that only very briefly at this point because that form of adoptionism is going to resurface later in the early 400s, or at least it's going to be characterized as resurfacing in the teachings of Nestorius. Nestorius, one-time bishop of Constantinople. So we'll come to that in due course, but I simply want to make you aware of that Christological issue as well here as we're thinking about material from the 3rd century. So with that, I will pause our video, and we'll make this part 1, and then we'll record another video here for part 2 to introduce the material for weeks 5 and 6.